I've been in this hobby for over 20 years, and I've never had a fully painted cohesive army. So this counts, right? Right? As a tabletop gamer, I love skirmish games because they don't take 3 hours to play. And as a painter, only having a handful of models being your entire force feels weird. But it does mean we can spend more time on each model without having to slug it out with potentially hundreds of models before we burn out and even get to roll dice. Because I like to try and do a little bit of something for everyone, we're going to do two styles, one with the airbrush and one without. And yes, I put Harlequin masks on all of these so they look like Scooby-Doo villains.
Alright, let's knock out this airbrushed one real quick. I'm only showing one on camera, but I actually batch painted all three of them at the same time, and it took maybe less than an hour. While typically I prime everything in black, this is actually one that I wanted starting in white, so we went over with a little bit of white just to spray it down. With a little bit more forethought than me, you could probably just start with a white primer. When it's the same color as white on rice on a paper plate in a snowstorm, you can start to add some wicked pink in there. And because we're airbrushing and setting up some gradients, you can just go ahead and spray the whole thing down. There's really not a lot to this one, it's basically just to make these three models look like the flames on the other main models. You know, the ones that we're going to care about later in the video. I don't want to say that these ones are going to be throwaway chaff, but that's pretty much what they are. With Diabolic Plum, we're going to be aiming for the tips of the flames and then probably the bottom third of the robes. This one I did do quite gradually because I really do want that gradient in there. I want it to be nice and smooth. Now with some matte black thinned way down, I'm just going to aim for the very bottom of the robes and somewhere between the base. You don't see it here, but I also aim for the top of the flames, just to kind of smooth it on out. When that's done, we're going to grab out a brush and some white paint. In my head, I was thinning the white paint down so much that it was going to kind of flow through all the crevices, and it just didn't do that. So we just went back up to a normal paint consistency and just aimed for the bottom or the most intense part of where we wanted the glow. So places like the base of the flames and the top of the flying testicle things. With some burning all orange, I'm just going to aim it all over that white and then kind of fade it back into that pink. All we're looking for with this one is just popping gradients. And while we are looking for those gradients and we want that overspray, that overspill, we still want a little bit of precision here. Now for the masks, I'm going to take Aquamarine and base coat the entire thing, and we're doing the exact same for every single mask in this unit. So remember this step for later on. After we've got our base coat on, we're going to mix just a little bit of white into that and start picking out some of the highlights. This is super easy and that's all we're doing. I wanted to show some detail off in the face so we can actually see some details in the face, but I didn't really want to pick everything out crazy. So here's the thing, I actually hate painting cloaks and robes. It's just not my jam. I've never found it fun or interesting or anything else like that. And yes, it is a little bit insane that I picked the warband that's all cloaks and robes. Now here's the thing, this is what I'm trying to do. This is all going to be wet blended, but I did want to start setting out and sketching where I wanted shadows and highlights. So we've started this off with Triumphant Navy, which is a pretty strong pale blue because it's actually from the strong pale blue family in the Fanatics line. And I painted everything that wasn't the deepest recess, we just left those black. Then to start building up some highlights and some volumes, I jumped into Imperial Navy, which is a lot more vivid. Don't worry, this is not where this is all ending. This is literally just a value sketch so we can see where we're going to start placing things and where we want to work around and where the light's coming from. So with this Imperial Navy, we start picking out what would probably be the midtone. Still continuing with the same idea, I went straight into Turquoise Siren and I wanted to pick out the highest highlights. So all the tops of all those wrinkles and folds is getting just a little bit of this. Again, this is definitely one you want to trust the process, but this is going to help you out a bunch. Value sketching and doing things like this really helps your eye to see where things can be finely placed. You can play around with it before it's actually set, or you spend hours in trying to make it all smooth and poppy. Think of this as some kind of map or a guide that you're setting for yourself to know where you want to place these colors. I also like to use the actual colors that I'm going to be blending back into. If we already have those colors there set, we know what we're blending back into and it's not so far of a jump. And here's where the wet blending starts. So everywhere that I've got covered with Turquoise Siren, I'm going back over with another coat and then coming back in with the Imperial Navy and going underneath it, wiping off the brush and then start mixing on the model. It still seems insane to me that some people look at wet blending as an expert only technique. It's legitimately something that we've all been doing most probably before we even picked up miniatures. You're taking two wet paints next to each other and swishing them together to make that gradient. And honestly, next to the airbrush, this is probably the easiest way to get gradients in miniature painting. Of course, glazing does the exact same thing, but that's, many coats and a lot of time. In saying that, you don't have to look at those two techniques as completely separate and you can't intertwine them. If you go down with your wet blend and get, 90% of everything done and placed in how you liked it, you can go back in with glazes and start refining. But for me, I'm just going to jump up into the next color and start highlighting stuff. For this, I used Neptune Glow and basically just picked out where everything super shiny would be, and yes, I did went blend it back into the next one down. Let me show you about combining those two techniques. So we're going to do a little bit of OSL. There's going to be some pink magenta glow. So obviously I'm starting off with Diabolic Plum, and then we're going to mix that into our Imperial Navy, just like a normal wet blend, just like we've been doing for the rest of the robe. At this point, it's all wet blending. We know exactly what we were doing. We've been doing it for the last hour, or at least I was at this point. And we're just getting our placements down. Now what I'm doing here is coming in with what we'd call a heavy glaze. It's thin, it's transparent, but it's not so thin and transparent that you get absolutely no color change. And one of the best parts about glazing is you don't actually have to swap out colors that often, because you are creating that gradient, that transition between the first color and what you're painting with now. It will start to get stronger as it becomes more opaque. The more layers you add, the stronger it gets. And honestly, that's going to do us for the rose. Now we can channel a little bit of that Chris Evans magic. I know some people can get fairly wild with flame colors, and I am definitely one of them. If you remember the same colors that we use for our little torch guys, that's exactly what we're doing here, except we're using the brush. See, there is a little something for everyone. Now you can do this same pattern with a brush. Starting from that white base coat, we're going straight into Wicked Pink because it has the massive pop that we're after. For this part, I'm going to go ahead and cover probably the top 2/3 of all the flames on the models. At the moment, you really don't have to be overly precise or clean. You don't have to have a line or a nice gradient down there, because we're going to be coming back in forward with a bunch of other colors. This one, I'm actually going into Diabolic Plum and just kind of pushing it back just on the top 2/3 of the top 2/3 of the flame. This one, I did thin down that little bit just so we would have a little bit of a nicer gradient between the two. The other thing you may notice is I don't do any OSL from the flames themselves. I think one of the coolest ideas for me personally when doing spectral light or spectral flames is that it glows, but it doesn't affect the surroundings. For some reason, that makes it feel so much more mystical and magical for me. I'm also just going to black out the tips a little. Jumping back into our burning ore, we're just going to cover up all the white bits that are left over. And because orange is generally a fairly thin color or a thin paint to work with, it doesn't matter if you're going to go over some of those pink parts. It's actually fairly encouraged to go over those, and you create a little blend there. We're going to jump into the next section, but I'm also going to be using the same colors in a very similar way, so just check that out. Because this is awesome, I'm going to do this to a Space Marine. Keep in mind, these are the exact same three colors that we just used: the burning ore, the wicked pink, and the diabolic plum. Since we are going over black, I did go straight to the burning ore, and yes, it took 2 coats. From here, through all the blurry shaky cam footage, we're going to jump into our wicked pink and just start to base coat again, leaving a bunch of that ore because we're going to wet blend it back together. Because one of my favorite things happens when you blend pink or magenta with orange. They start to superheat each other. It just becomes this awesome gradient of massive, vibrant heat explosion. And of course, you can come back over with either color and blend back with a glaze to either direction. When that's done, we're just going to do the exact same thing again with Diabolic Plum, but just on the opposite end. And yes, after adding some Diabolic Plum, I am going to come back in with some pink, and we're going to wet blend those two things together as well to create that gradient. And yeah, I know I say gradient a lot in these videos. And that's it for the Miami Sunset. Here's something that you might actually use. When I first started miniature painting and I saw professionals going between greens and pinks and blues for skin, it blew my mind. So starting off with Necrotic Flesh, we're just going to give it that base coat. What I'm aiming for here is some kind of sickly but still alive and living skin color. I don't want to make it feel sickly like Nurgle, but just like there's a little bit of life that's being sucked out of it. It's like they're married or something. From here, I'm going in with a really thin glaze of our Triumphant Navy and just adding some blue tones in there so it feels colder. This is also going to work as our shadow tones for most of the skin. From here, I'm taking Ruby Skin, which is your standard fleshy pink tone, and this is where I'm going to start layering. What all the pink and the red will do in the Ruby Skin was start to negate some of the greenish tones that come out from the Necrotic Flesh. So with this, I'm just going to be doing a lot of the highlights and most of the mid-tones. This is what we're really aiming for here. Leave the recesses with that blue and that green mix and you'll be golden. And now, because we still want it to feel like living flesh, like there's blood under the surface, we're coming in with that wicked pink in a really thin glaze. And with this, we're going to aim for things like the knuckles on the hands and some parts around the face that would become flustered. I know I paint a lot of big saturated colors a lot of the time, but this is honestly one of my favorite flesh recipes. And look, I think we can call it. Even though the premise for this video was that you could spend more time on less models with skirmish games, it doesn't mean that you have to spend a ridiculous amount of time on them. I'd probably call these ones somewhere around tabletop standard, but to finish 8 miniatures in a day to kind of get here, I'm happy with that. Painting large quantities of models can really start to suck the soul and the fun out of the hobby. And that's not what we're here for. If we want to have fun with the hobby, we should be having fun with the hobby. Let's put a bow on it. Massive thank you to InGames, the Army Painter, everybody that watches the videos, and of course all of our amazing Patreons. Check out the description and you'll find links for merch, dice, and the Patreon. And if you like the music in today's video, that's also in there. That was all me. As always, big love, and we'll see you next time.